You really think she understands a single word we're saying? Ethan Sterling didn't even bother lowering his voice. The laughter that followed rolled across the private dining room like a wave, quiet at first, then growing bolder as expensive crystal glasses caught the glow of the chandelier above. It was the kind of laughter that came from people who believed the room belonged to them. The kind that came easy when power, money, and influence sat comfortably at the same table. High above downtown Chicago, on the 62nd floor of the Meridian Crown Hotel, a deal worth nearly $800 million was only hours away from becoming official. The city stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows in every direction, a sea of lights glittering beneath the dark spring sky. Inside the private dining suite, however, nobody was looking at the view. Every eye was fixed on the men gathered around the polished walnut table. Investors from Dubai, executives from New York, attorneys, advisors, industry leaders whose signatures could move markets before sunrise. At the center sat Ethan Sterling, 41 years old, founder and CEO of Sterling Global Capital. Tall, confident, and impossibly composed, he carried himself like a man who had never entered a room without assuming he would leave as the most important person inside it. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly. His silver watch reflected the candlelight each time he raised his hand. Tonight was supposed to be another victory, another headline, another reminder that everything he touched seemed to turn into profit. Across the room, Naomi Carter moved quietly between tables carrying a tray of sparkling water and wine. Her uniform was simple: black vest, white shirt, neatly pressed apron. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention. In fact, most people hadn't looked at her twice all evening. That was normal. Naomi had worked enough luxury events to understand the invisible rules. Wealthy guests often noticed the service long before they noticed the people providing it. She didn't take it personally. At 27, she had learned that silence could be a kind of strength. So she kept moving, refilling glasses, collecting plates, listening without appearing to listen, watching without appearing to watch. The room smelled faintly of cedar, imported leather, and expensive steak. Conversations drifted from stock prices to international expansion plans. Numbers floated through the air like confetti. 50 million, 200 million, $500 million. To the people at the table, they were ordinary figures. To everyone else, they represented lifetimes of earnings. Ethan leaned toward two investors seated beside him. The men exchanged comments in Arabic before smiling. One of them glanced briefly toward Naomi. Ethan followed his gaze and smirked. "Trust me," he said in Arabic, his voice relaxed. "She has no idea what we're talking about." More laughter followed. One executive shook his head and replied with something that made the entire side of the table chuckle again. Naomi continued pouring water as though she hadn't heard a thing. Her expression never changed. Her hands remained steady. Her posture remained professional. But for the first time that evening, her eyes lifted slightly. Just enough to study the faces around the table. Just enough to recognize the confidence behind their laughter. And just enough to understand that before the night was over, everything in this room was about to change. The dinner continued as if nothing unusual had happened, yet something subtle had shifted beneath the polished surface of the evening. The laughter around Ethan Sterling's table grew louder with every round of conversation, fueled by confidence and the assumption that every person in the room occupied exactly the place they deserved. Outside, the Chicago skyline shimmered against the night sky, but inside the Meridian Crown Hotel, attention remained fixed on the deal that promised to reshape two industries at once. $800 million. The number floated through nearly every discussion. It appeared in presentations, projections, and whispered conversations between attorneys reviewing final documents. To the investors, it represented opportunity. To Ethan, it represented legacy. He intended to leave the building before midnight with signatures secured and another victory added to his reputation. Naomi Carter moved steadily through the room, collecting empty glasses and replacing silverware between courses. Most guests barely acknowledged her presence. A few offered polite smiles. Others never looked up from their conversations. Years of working in luxury hospitality had taught her how to read people quickly. Some wore confidence. Some wore insecurity disguised as confidence. And some wore power so long they forgot other people could see through it. Ethan belonged to the third category. Near the center of the table, One of the Middle Eastern investors unfolded a leather portfolio and placed several documents beside his plate. The pages contained notes, translated contract summaries, and handwritten calculations. As the discussion intensified, papers shifted from one side of the table to the other. Advisors leaned in. Attorneys compared figures. Everyone appeared focused on details. Yet Naomi noticed something else. Several guests kept returning to the Arabic version of the agreement rather than the English one displayed on the presentation screen. She found that interesting. Most international negotiations relied heavily on certified translations. Rechecking language repeatedly usually meant one of two things. Someone was extremely cautious, or someone was uncertain. A server beside her quietly asked whether table 7 needed more sparkling water. Naomi nodded and reached for a fresh bottle. As she approached Ethan's group, fragments of Arabic drifted through the air again. The conversation moved quickly, too quickly for most listeners to follow. One investor asked a question. Another answered. Ethan smiled confidently despite clearly depending on the interpreter seated nearby. The interpreter translated only portions of the discussion before returning to silence. The room remained relaxed, but Naomi noticed a few exchanged glances among the investors. Brief, almost invisible, the kind of looks that suggested private calculations were taking place behind public smiles. She refilled a glass and stepped back. That was when she saw it. A folded sheet partially exposed beneath one of the portfolios. Only a few lines were visible. Most people would have ignored it. Naomi did not. Her eyes landed on a number written in Arabic script. Then another. Her expression remained calm, but something in her attention sharpened instantly. The figure differed from the one displayed on the presentation screen across the room. Not by a few $100s. Not by a few thousand. By an amount large enough to alter the entire structure of the agreement. Naomi looked away immediately. Maybe she had misread it. Maybe there was additional context she could not see. Yet the feeling remained. Quiet. Persistent. Like a distant alarm nobody else could hear. Around her, waiters carried dessert plates. Investors toasted future success. Ethan Sterling leaned back in his chair, completely certain the evening was unfolding exactly as planned. And somewhere beneath the glow of chandeliers and the comfort of confidence, a mistake was waiting patiently for someone to notice it. Naomi tried to focus on her work, but the number stayed in her mind long after she stepped away from the table. It lingered there like a song she could not stop hearing. One figure on the presentation screen. A different figure on the document she had glimpsed. Perhaps there was an explanation. Perhaps there was an amendment she had not seen. Yet the uneasiness refused to disappear. Across the dining room, dessert service began. Small plates carrying chocolate mousse, fresh berries, and delicate pastries appeared beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. The atmosphere remained polished and elegant, but beneath the surface, tension was quietly building. The final signing ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 45 minutes. Everyone knew it. Conversations became more focused. Smiles became more strategic. Even the waitstaff could sense that the evening was entering its most important stage. Ethan Sterling appeared completely at ease. He laughed easily, exchanged stories with investors, and accepted congratulations before the deal was even complete. Confidence surrounded him like an expensive cologne. For years, that confidence had helped him build one of the most successful investment firms in the country. Tonight, it seemed stronger than ever. Meanwhile, several of the investors continued speaking Arabic among themselves. Their voices remained calm, but Naomi noticed a subtle difference. Earlier, the conversations had sounded relaxed. Now they sounded more deliberate, more careful. As she delivered coffee to a nearby table, a few familiar phrases drifted toward her. She recognized them immediately, not because she had overheard them tonight, but because she had spent years studying them. The language felt as natural to her as English. Every expression carried meaning. Every choice of words revealed intention. One investor mentioned a percentage adjustment. Another referenced liability exposure. A third quietly discussed projected revenue transfers. Naomi kept walking. Her face revealed nothing, yet her attention sharpened with every sentence. Then she heard something that made her stop for half a second. Not physically, only mentally. A phrase connected directly to the number she had seen on the document. The investor spoke casually, assuming nobody outside their circle could understand. The others nodded. One of them smiled. Suddenly, the discrepancy made sense. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. It was not a simple typo. It was not a formatting issue. It was a translation difference buried deep inside the agreement. The English version described one set of financial obligations. The Arabic version described another, similar enough to avoid immediate suspicion, different enough to create enormous consequences later. She carefully placed a coffee cup in front of a guest and continued moving. Her heartbeat remained steady, but her thoughts accelerated. Surely the attorneys had reviewed everything. Surely dozens of experts had examined every line before reaching this stage. Yet the more she listened, the less certain she became. The investors spoke openly because they believed nobody around them could understand. And what Naomi was hearing did not sound like confusion. It sounded like awareness. Near the windows, city lights reflected against the glass like thousands of tiny stars. Inside the room, nobody appeared alarmed. Nobody appeared concerned. The executives discussed future partnerships. The attorneys organized paperwork. The photographers prepared equipment for the signing ceremony. Everything looked perfect. That was what made the situation so dangerous. Major mistakes rarely arrived with warning sirens. They arrived wearing confidence. They arrived hidden beneath handshakes and celebration. Naomi glanced toward the large screen displaying the final contract summary. Then she looked back toward the investors. One of them quietly repeated the same financial figure she had seen earlier. This time there was no doubt. The difference represented hundreds of millions of dollars. Her hands tightened around the serving tray. For the first time that evening, she faced a choice she never expected to make. Remain silent and continue doing her job, or risk everything by speaking about something nobody would believe a waitress could possibly understand. The closer Naomi looked, the harder it became to convince herself she was mistaken. Every detail she had overheard fit together too cleanly. The numbers, the language, the confidence. It was like watching pieces of a puzzle lock into place one by one. Across the room, staff members quietly cleared dessert plates while event coordinators prepared for the final signing ceremony. A small stage had already been arranged near the windows. 2 leather chairs waited beneath soft lighting. A polished table held the official contracts. In less than 30 minutes, cameras would capture what everyone expected to be a historic partnership. Yet Naomi could no longer focus on the celebration. She focused on the documents, on the conversations, on the growing certainty that something was wrong. She moved toward a service station near the entrance where several extra folders had been placed temporarily before the ceremony. Most contained schedules and presentation notes. One folder, however, carried the same logo she had seen on the investor documents earlier. The cover had been left partially open. Naomi hesitated. She was not looking for trouble. She was not trying to involve herself in corporate negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She simply needed to know whether what she suspected was real. For a brief moment, the hallway beside the station stood empty. Guests remained inside the dining room. Coordinators were occupied near the stage. Naomi glanced toward the folder and saw a familiar page. Arabic text, financial clauses, percentage allocations. Her eyes moved quickly across the lines. Years earlier, she had spent countless nights studying similar documents. Not because she planned to work in hospitality forever, but because language had always fascinated her. While other students relaxed during weekends, Naomi had buried herself in books, transcripts, and international business journals. She loved discovering how a single word could completely change meaning across cultures. And now that knowledge was staring back at her from the page. The discrepancy was real. The English contract described one revenue-sharing structure. The Arabic version described another. Not dramatically different at first glance. Different enough to redirect hundreds of millions of dollars over the lifetime of the agreement. Naomi slowly closed the folder. Her pulse quickened. This was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact. Before she could process what to do next, a voice interrupted her thoughts. There you are. Naomi turned. Ethan Sterling stood several feet away holding a glass of sparkling water. His expression carried mild amusement. I was beginning to think the service staff disappeared. The comment drew a few chuckles from nearby executives. Naomi offered a polite smile. I apologize, sir. Is there anything you need? Ethan glanced toward the dining room. Just make sure everyone is ready. Tonight is important. We cannot afford mistakes. The irony passed through Naomi's mind instantly. She wondered how he would react if he knew what sat inside the contract waiting for his signature. Yet she said nothing. Ethan nodded toward a group of investors speaking Arabic nearby. Interesting crowd, huh? He said casually. Sometimes I wonder if they realize nobody else understands half of what they say. More laughter followed. One executive smirked. Another added a comment under his breath. Naomi recognized every word. She understood every sentence. She understood the assumptions hiding behind them too. To them, she was background noise. Invisible. Safe to ignore. Ethan took a sip of water and looked directly at her. Still, I guess none of that matters. You probably hear foreign languages all night. Naomi met his gaze for a brief second. Calm. Professional. Unreadable. Then she lowered her eyes respectfully and stepped away. But as she walked toward the service corridor, one thought echoed louder than all the conversations in the room. In less than 30 minutes, Ethan Sterling was about to sign a contract he did not fully understand. And the only person who knew it was standing in a waitress uniform. The service corridor felt strangely quiet compared to the energy inside the dining room. Naomi stood beside a stainless steel preparation counter, staring at nothing while her mind raced through every possible outcome. She had spent years learning when to speak and when to stay silent. Working in luxury hospitality taught that lesson quickly. Guests rarely wanted opinions. Executives rarely welcomed interruptions. People with influence preferred certainty, even when certainty was wrong. Yet tonight's silence carried a price. Through the open doorway, she could hear the ceremony preparations accelerating. Microphones were being tested. Cameras were being positioned. Event staff were arranging the final seating layout. Every sound felt like a ticking clock. 20 minutes remained before signatures met paper. 20 minutes before a mistake worth hundreds of millions of dollars became legally binding. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. Part of her wanted to walk away, finish her shift, collect her paycheck, go home. None of this belonged to her world. The contract was not hers. The investors were not hers. The consequences were not hers. Yet another part of her refused to ignore what she knew. Knowledge carried responsibility. That lesson had been taught to her long before she ever wore a waitress uniform. Years earlier, she had been a scholarship student studying international languages and cross-cultural business communication. Her professors used to repeat the same principle. Translation was not about words. Translation was about consequences. A single misunderstood phrase could start an argument, destroy a partnership, or cost millions of dollars. Tonight she was staring directly at one of those moments. Inside the ballroom, applause suddenly erupted. Naomi looked through the doorway. Ethan Sterling was standing near the stage speaking with investors. He looked relaxed, confident, victorious. The audience responded warmly to every comment he made. Nobody watching him would have guessed that a hidden flaw sat quietly inside the documents waiting for his signature. A younger server approached Naomi carrying empty trays. "You okay?" she asked. Naomi forced a small smile. "Just thinking." The server laughed softly. "Bad night to think too much. Everybody seems happy in there." Naomi glanced back toward the ballroom. Happy. The word felt almost ironic. Happiness often appeared right before reality arrived. She thanked the server and continued watching the room. An attorney walked onto the stage carrying the final agreement. Cameras immediately turned toward him. The audience settled into their seats. 15 minutes. That was all that remained. Naomi's pulse quickened. If she spoke up, people might assume she was confused. They might laugh. They might accuse her of misunderstanding documents she had no business reading. Worse, she could lose her job for interfering. The risk was real. Yet every minute that passed made silence harder to justify. Across the room, Ethan accepted another round of congratulations. One investor joked about celebrating before midnight. Everyone laughed. Naomi did not. She noticed something else. The same investor who had discussed the altered financial terms earlier exchanged a brief glance with another executive. It lasted less than a second. Most people would have missed it entirely. Naomi did not. The look carried confidence. The confidence of someone who believed everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. That was the moment her uncertainty disappeared. She no longer wondered whether she should act. The only question was how. A voice announced that the signing ceremony would begin in 10 minutes. Applause filled the ballroom once again. Naomi stared at the stage, then at the contract, then at Ethan Sterling. 10 minutes. 10 minutes before a decision made in silence would echo for years. And for the first time that night, Naomi Carter stopped thinking like a waitress and started thinking like the scholar she had once been. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the final portion of the evening. The room responded with polite applause. Camera lights brightened. Attorneys took their seats. Investors adjusted their jackets. The atmosphere carried the energy of a moment people expected to remember for years. Naomi stood near the edge of the ballroom, holding an empty serving tray, watching the countdown reach its final minutes. Every instinct told her to stay where she was. Every lesson she had learned as a service worker told her not to interrupt powerful people. Yet another voice inside her refused to remain quiet. The contracts were placed on the polished signing table. Ethan Sterling smiled as photographers gathered closer. One of the lead investors sat opposite him, ready to finalize the agreement. The audience settled into silence. A senior attorney began reviewing the final terms for the room. Revenue projections, market expansion goals, partnership objectives. Everything sounded flawless. Everything sounded certain. Naomi felt her heart pounding. Then she saw the Arabic version of the contract placed beside the English one. That was it. The moment had arrived. The attorney reached the final page and nodded toward Ethan. "Mr. Sterling, if you are satisfied, we are prepared to proceed." Pens were placed on the table. Cameras focused. The room leaned forward. Naomi took a breath. Then another. Before she could lose her nerve, she stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir." Her voice was not loud. Yet in the silence of the ballroom, it carried farther than she expected. Heads turned immediately. Conversations stopped. Ethan looked up, clearly surprised to hear a waitress interrupt the ceremony. The attorney frowned slightly. Several guests exchanged confused glances. Naomi felt every eye in the room land on her at once. "I apologize for speaking out of turn," she said carefully, "but I believe there may be a problem with the contract." The silence that followed felt enormous. Ethan blinked. For a moment, he looked as though he was waiting for someone else to explain what had just happened. A few people laughed softly, assuming there had been some misunderstanding. One executive shook his head. Another checked his watch impatiently. Ethan offered a controlled smile. "A problem?" he asked. "With a contract reviewed by multiple legal teams?" Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir." The smile on Ethan's face tightened slightly. "And how exactly would you know that?" The question drew a few quiet chuckles. Naomi could hear them. She ignored them. "Because the Arabic version does not say exactly the same thing as the English version." Every smile in the room disappeared. The change was immediate. Sharp. Almost physical. Ethan stared at her. The investors stared at her. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then one of the investors laughed and said something in Arabic. Naomi turned toward him calmly and answered in flawless Arabic. Not one sentence. Not one memorized phrase. An entire explanation. Clear. Precise. Professional. The effect was instant. The investor's expression froze. Another investor sat upright in his chair. The interpreter's eyes widened. Around the ballroom, confusion spread like a ripple across water. Ethan Sterling remained motionless. Earlier that night, he had assumed she could not understand a word being said around him. Now she was discussing contract language with native speakers, while half the room struggled to keep up. And for the first time since the evening began, the most powerful man in the ballroom looked completely unprepared for what came next. The ballroom remained frozen. Nobody reached for a glass. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody whispered to the person beside them. The entire room seemed suspended between disbelief and curiosity. Naomi stood calmly near the signing table, while dozens of executives stared at her as if they were seeing her for the first time. Only minutes earlier she had been invisible. Now she was the center of the room. One of the senior investors leaned forward and responded to her in Arabic. His tone was measured but challenging. Naomi answered immediately. Her words flowed with confidence and precision. There was no hesitation, no searching for vocabulary, no uncertainty. The conversation sounded natural, the kind that comes only from years of study and practice. The investor's expression shifted. Another executive joined the discussion. Then another. Within moments, Naomi was speaking comfortably with 3 different people across the table while the interpreter sat silent beside them. Ethan Sterling watched without moving. His confidence had not vanished completely, but cracks had begun to appear. For the first time that evening, he was no longer controlling the conversation. One of the attorneys finally cleared his throat. "Can someone explain what is happening?" he asked. The lead investor turned toward him. She is correct, he said. There is a significant difference between the English and Arabic versions regarding long-term revenue obligations. The room erupted into murmurs. Executives exchanged alarmed glances. Advisors immediately reached for copies of the contract. Several attorneys opened folders and began comparing pages line by line. The atmosphere transformed instantly. Celebration disappeared. Analysis took its place. Ethan looked from the documents to Naomi. How did you catch that? He asked quietly. Naomi met his gaze. Because I understood what everyone was saying. The answer landed harder than anyone expected. Earlier that night, assumptions had filled the room. Assumptions about language. Assumptions about education. Assumptions about who mattered and who did not. Now those assumptions were collapsing one after another. An older investor standing near the stage suddenly narrowed his eyes. He studied Naomi carefully. For several seconds he said nothing. Then recognition appeared on his face. Wait, he said slowly. Naomi Carter? She looked surprised. Yes. The investor smiled in disbelief. The University of Chicago International Languages Program? Several people turned toward him. Naomi nodded. That was years ago. The man laughed softly and shook his head. Years ago, maybe. But I remember your name. You won the regional multilingual research competition. Arabic, French, and Mandarin. You were the top student. More silence followed. Ethan blinked. Several attorneys looked at Naomi differently now. Not as a waitress interrupting a ceremony. As someone whose expertise had just prevented a major mistake. The investor continued. I was a guest speaker at that event. Your presentation was exceptional. Naomi smiled politely. Thank you. Ethan looked genuinely confused. If you had that background, why are you working here? The question hung in the air. Naomi paused before answering. Life changes plans sometimes. Her voice remained calm. My mother became ill during graduate school. I left to help support my family. One job became 2 jobs. Then years passed. Nobody laughed. Nobody made jokes. The room understood the weight behind simple responsibilities. The investor nodded respectfully. Well, tonight those years of study may have saved everyone at this table a very expensive lesson. Around the ballroom, legal teams continued reviewing the documents. More discrepancies surfaced. Small differences. Important differences. Enough to delay the signing entirely. Ethan Sterling remained seated, staring at the contract that had seemed flawless less than 30 minutes earlier. For years he had trusted credentials, titles, and appearances to identify expertise. Tonight expertise had arrived wearing a server's uniform, and the realization was beginning to change everything. What had begun as a celebration now looked more like an emergency board meeting. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed completely. The soft music still played through hidden speakers. The city lights still glittered beyond the windows. The chandeliers still cast their warm golden glow across the room. Yet the mood felt entirely different. Groups of attorneys stood around tables covered with documents. Financial analysts reviewed numbers on tablets. Investors spoke in hushed voices. The signing ceremony had been suspended indefinitely. Nobody seemed concerned about dinner anymore. Everyone cared about the contract. Ethan Sterling remained seated near the stage, watching legal teams compare versions of the agreement page by page. Every few minutes another discrepancy appeared. None of them were obvious enough to trigger immediate suspicion on their own. Together, however, they painted a troubling picture. The differences altered risk exposure, payment schedules, long-term obligations, revenue distribution, small changes on paper, massive consequences in reality. Several executives who had congratulated Ethan earlier now looked uneasy. One attorney approached the stage carrying a marked-up copy of the contract. There are more inconsistencies than we initially thought, he said carefully. We cannot recommend signing tonight. A quiet wave of disappointment moved through the room. For some people, months of planning had just been delayed. For others, the delay represented something far more valuable. Protection. Ethan accepted the revised document and stared at the highlighted sections. The numbers seemed almost unreal now. Less than an hour earlier, he had been moments away from approving everything without hesitation. Across the ballroom, Naomi stood near a service station, no longer serving drinks. Nobody expected her to. Every person in the room knew exactly who she was now. The change felt almost surreal. Guests who had ignored her earlier suddenly greeted her respectfully. Attorneys asked questions. Investors requested clarification about specific phrases. The same expertise that had been invisible before now attracted attention from every direction. One of the Middle Eastern investors approached her with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "most people would have remained silent." Naomi smiled gently. "Most people probably would have assumed somebody else already noticed." The investor nodded. And yet nobody did. Nearby, another executive overheard the conversation. "That is the part one cannot stop thinking about," he admitted. Hundreds of professionals reviewed these documents. Somehow the person who caught the problem was not sitting at the negotiating table. The comment lingered in the air. It was not criticism. It was realization. A realization spreading across the room one person at a time. Expertise did not always arrive with a title. Intelligence did not always wear an expensive suit. Sometimes it stood quietly in the background while everyone else looked the wrong direction. Ethan eventually rose from his chair and walked toward the windows overlooking the city. For several minutes, he stood alone, watching, thinking. The skyline stretched endlessly beneath the dark sky. Thousands of lights illuminated streets, buildings, and bridges. Yet none of it seemed to hold his attention. His thoughts remained fixed on the events of the evening. He replayed every assumption he had made, every joke, every careless remark, every moment he had dismissed someone standing only a few feet away. The realization was uncomfortable because it was undeniable. He had spent years building a reputation for identifying talent and opportunity. Tonight, he had failed to recognize both while they stood directly in front of him. Behind him, conversations continued. Legal teams revised timelines. Investors discussed next steps. The deal itself was not dead. Far from it. In fact, several participants now believed the partnership would become stronger because the problems had been discovered before signatures were exchanged. Yet the biggest lesson of the night had nothing to do with contracts. It had everything to do with perception. And Ethan Sterling was finally beginning to understand that the most expensive mistake he nearly made was not hidden inside the agreement. It was hidden inside his own assumptions. By the time midnight approached, the ballroom looked nothing like it had at the beginning of the evening. The celebration had been replaced by careful discussion. The planned signing ceremony had become a strategy session. Lawyers continued reviewing revised documents. Investors gathered in small groups. The future of the partnership remained alive, but now it would move forward with transparency instead of assumptions. Outside the windows, Chicago glowed beneath the night sky. Inside, another kind of clarity had begun to settle over the room. Naomi was preparing to leave when she heard someone call her name. She turned and saw Ethan Sterling walking toward her. The room noticed immediately. Conversations softened. A few people paused what they were doing. Earlier that evening, Ethan had commanded the attention of the entire ballroom. Now he approached with a different kind of presence. Not weaker, just more honest. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Naomi for a moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology." The room became even quieter. Ethan glanced briefly toward the investors and attorneys nearby before returning his attention to her. "Not only for tonight," he continued, "but for every assumption I made before tonight." Naomi listened without interrupting. Ethan let out a slow breath. "I thought I knew exactly who belonged in this room. I thought I knew who had expertise and who did not. I was wrong." There was no defensiveness in his voice. No attempt to soften the admission. Just truth. The kind people rarely offer when pride stands in the way. Naomi smiled gently. "Everyone makes assumptions sometimes." Ethan nodded. "Maybe. But most assumptions do not nearly cost hundreds of millions of dollars." A few people nearby laughed quietly. The tension that had filled the ballroom for hours finally began to ease. Ethan looked around the room. "You saved this deal tonight." Naomi shook her head. "I helped identify a problem. Your team still has a lot of work ahead." "That may be true," Ethan replied. "But without you, there would not be a deal left to fix." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan reached into his jacket and removed a business card. Not with dramatic flair. Not as a reward. Simply as an opportunity. He handed it to her. "If you ever decide you want something different, call me." Naomi looked down at the card. It contained his direct contact information, the kind almost nobody received. Around them, investors and attorneys watched quietly. Ethan smiled. "And before you ask, no? This is not charity. It is the smartest professional recommendation I have made all year." That earned a few genuine laughs. Naomi folded the card carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. "Thank you." The older investor who recognized her earlier approached and joined the conversation. "You know," he said, "I have attended negotiations on 4 continents. Tonight was the first time a waitress corrected an international contract before a room full of executives." More laughter followed. "Then it was a memorable evening," Naomi replied. The investor smiled. "It was more than that. It was a reminder." His words lingered. A reminder. The entire night had become one. A reminder that talent does not always arrive with a title. A reminder that intelligence does not depend on status. A reminder that dignity belongs to everyone, whether they sit at the head of the table or stand quietly beside it. As Naomi finally walked toward the elevator, nobody ignored her. Nobody looked through her. The same room that had once overlooked her now watched her leave with respect. And somewhere between the chandeliers, the contracts, and the city lights beyond the glass, an unforgettable lesson remained behind. Ethan Sterling had entered the evening believing power was the most valuable thing in the room. He left understanding something far greater. Money could buy influence. Position could command attention. But respect had to be earned. And on that night, the person who earned the most respect was the woman everyone thought they could overlook.